The Abandoned Bride. When Margaret Hale stepped off the stage in Copper Springs, Montana, she carried everything she owned in a battered trunk and a heart full of desperate hope. The mail-order bride had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man she'd never met, only to be turned away at his gate like unwanted cargo before she ever crossed his threshold. Humiliated, penniless, and stranded under the merciless summer sun, she stood at the entrance to a life that would never be hers. But when a quiet rancher named Elias Boone rode past and saw injustice written in her eyes, he made a choice that would change both their lives forever. If you're watching from your city tonight, drop a comment below and let me know where this story is reaching. I love seeing how far these tales travel. Now settle in. This is Margaret and Elias's story, and it's just beginning. The Montana sun beat down on Margaret Hale's shoulders like a blacksmith's hammer, relentless and unforgiving. She stood beside the ornate iron gate of the Langdon Ranch, her trunk at her feet, her traveling dress already dusty from the long stagecoach journey that had brought her across half the country to this moment. The gate was closed. Locked, actually. And on the other side, through the bars decorated with scrollwork that seemed to mock her with their elegance, she could see the sprawling ranch house she would never enter. Victor Langdon hadn't even had the decency to meet her in town. He'd sent his foreman, a hard-faced man named Ricketts, who'd looked her up and down like livestock at auction and found her wanting. The conversation, if it could be called that, had lasted less than 5 minutes. "Mr. Langdon has reconsidered the arrangement," Ricketts had said, his voice flat and final. "He don't need a wife after all. You can take the next stage back east." Margaret had stood there in the dusty street, her carefully composed letters of introduction suddenly worthless paper in her reticule, and felt the bottom drop out of her carefully constructed future. She'd spent her last dollars on the fare west. There was no money for a return trip. There was no money for anything. "I came 2,000 miles, she'd said, and hated how small her voice sounded. "I sold everything I owned." Ricketts had shrugged. "Ain't my concern, ma'am." Mr. Langdon made his decision. He'd at least arranged for her trunk to be brought to the ranch gate, a cruel courtesy that left her stranded at the threshold of the life she'd been promised but would never live. Then he'd ridden back through those gates and left her standing there, as though she were just another problem solved by being ignored. That had been 2 hours ago. Margaret wasn't crying. She'd learned years ago that tears accomplish nothing except to make people uncomfortable and yourself weaker. Instead, she stood very still in the shade of a cottonwood tree just outside the gate, taking inventory of her situation with the same methodical calm she'd used when her father died and left her penniless, when her aunt made it clear there was no permanent place for her in Baltimore, when she'd answered Victor Langdon's advertisement for a practical, educated woman to become his wife. She had $4.37. Her trunk contained 3 dresses, 2 pairs of shoes, undergarments, her mother's Bible, and a packet of letters that represented 6 months of correspondence with a man who apparently changed his mind as easily as he changed his shirt. The nearest town was Copper Springs, 3 miles back down a road she'd already traveled. She had no connections there, no friends, no prospects. The stage east wouldn't run again for 4 days, and even if it did, she couldn't afford passage. Margaret looked down at her hands. They were good hands, strong, capable, unmarked by the soft life some women led. She'd worked as a companion to her aunt, managing household accounts, organizing social events, teaching her young cousins their letters. Before that, she'd helped her father in his bookshop, learning to value precision and honesty over sentiment. Those hands had written careful, truthful letters to Victor Langdon. She'd never claimed to be beautiful. She wasn't. She'd never promised to be meek or ornamental. She'd offered competence, partnership, and the kind of practical intelligence that built stable homes. His letters in return had suggested he valued exactly those qualities. Apparently, he'd been lying. Or perhaps she simply wasn't what he'd imagined. Perhaps when his friends saw the woman he'd ordered like furniture from a catalog, they'd laughed. Perhaps he'd decided that a wife who looked like Margaret, tall, angular, with a face more interesting than pretty, would be an embarrassment. The thoughts were bitter, but Margaret had long practice in swallowing bitter things. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up. A rider was approaching from the direction of town, a single man on a sturdy bay horse, riding with the easy confidence of someone who knew this land intimately. As he drew closer, Margaret could see he wasn't young, probably in his late 30s, with dark hair showing threads of gray at the temples and sun-weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. He wore working clothes, plain cotton shirt, worn leather vest, dusty trousers, and boots that had seen better days. A battered hat shaded eyes that were studying her with quiet attention. He slowed his horse as he reached the gate, then stopped entirely, sitting silent for a long moment. Margaret lifted her chin. She would not apologize for existing. "Afternoon, ma'am." His voice was low and careful, with a slight roughness that suggested he didn't use it much. "You waiting for someone?" "No." The word came out more sharply than she'd intended. He glanced at the locked gate, then at her trunk, then back at her face. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. A kind of recognition, perhaps, or understanding. "You the mail-order bride Victor was expecting?" Margaret's throat tightened, so the whole territory knew about her humiliation. "I was." "And he turned you away?" It wasn't a question, but Margaret answered anyway. "Before I ever set foot on his property, yes." The rider was quiet again, looking past her at the Langdon ranch house, visible in the distance, a monument to wealth built on land and cattle and the labor of men who lived in bunkhouses while Victor Langdon lived in luxury. "That's about what I'd expect from Victor," the man said finally. His tone was neutral, but there was granite underneath. "He's got no sense of honor and less sense of decency." Margaret blinked. In her experience, men didn't criticize other men to strange women, particularly not in small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. The rider swung down from his horse with fluid ease. Up close, he was taller than she'd thought, easily 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the kind of build that came from years of physical labor. His face was weathered but not harsh, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than he frowned, though he wasn't smiling now. "Name's Elias Boone," he said. "I ranch about 8 miles northwest of here. Small operation, just me and a couple of seasonal hands." "Margaret Hale." She kept her voice steady, though I suppose that doesn't matter much anymore. "Matters to you, I expect." Elias looked at her trunk again. "You got anywhere to go?" The question was asked gently, but it still felt like a knife between her ribs. "Not yet. I'm considering my options." Options being pretty limited, I'd guess, given that trunk and the way you're standing in the shade instead of heading back to town. Margaret's jaw tightened. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Boone, but I'm not asking for charity." "Didn't say you were." Elias pushed his hat back slightly. "I'm offering work if you want it. My place needs a housekeeper. Previous woman who helped out moved back east to live with her daughter, and I've been managing on my own for 3 months now. It shows." Margaret stared at him. "You're offering me employment? You don't know anything about me. I know you came 2,000 miles to keep a promise to a man who didn't keep his word to you. I know you're still standing here instead of falling apart, which takes more backbone than most people have." Elias met her eyes directly. "I know Victor Langdon's a fool, and I know my place needs help. If you can cook, clean, and manage a household, that's enough." "I can do all those things." Margaret's mind was racing, examining this unexpected offer from every angle, looking for the trap. "What are you expecting in return, Mr. Boone?" His expression didn't change. "Honest work for honest pay. Room and board, plus $20 a month. No obligations beyond keeping the house in order and cooking meals. You'd have your own room, door that locks from the inside. I'm not looking for anything but help running a household I've been neglecting." Men don't usually make offers like that to strange women. No, they usually leave strange women stranded at locked gates. There was a bite in Elias's voice now. "Look, Miss Hale, I'm not a talker and I'm not much for polite society, but I know right from wrong. What Victor did to you is wrong. I'm offering you an alternative. You can take it or leave it, but either way, I'll give you a ride into Copper Springs so you're not standing out here in the heat." Margaret studied him. His face was open, his posture relaxed but not presumptuous. His horse stood quietly, well cared for and patient. His clothes were clean, if worn. Everything about him suggested a man who was exactly what he claimed to be, a rancher who needed help and saw someone who needed work. She thought about Copper Springs, about $4.37, about the very limited options available to a woman alone in Montana Territory with no connections and no resources. She thought about Victor Langdon looking at her through his foreman's eyes and deciding she wasn't worth the trouble of a conversation. She thought about her hands and what they were capable of, and the fact that she'd come west to build a life, not to slink back east in defeat. "I'll need to see the accommodations," she said, "and we'll need to agree on terms in writing." For the first time, Elias smiled, a small, genuine expression that softened his weathered features. Seems fair. I've got paper and ink at the house. He moved to lift her trunk, and Margaret noticed the easy strength in the way he handled the weight that had taken 2 men to load onto the stagecoach. He secured it behind his saddle with practiced efficiency, then turned back to her. You ever ridden a horse, Miss Hale? No. Then you'll ride with me. It's 8 miles. Won't take more than an hour. He swung up into the saddle, then offered her his hand. Step on my boot, and I'll pull you up behind. Margaret hesitated for only a moment. Then she took his hand. It was calloused and warm and strong, put her foot on his boot, and let him pull her up behind the saddle. She settled herself as carefully as possible, trying not to think about the impropriety of sitting this close to a strange man. Hold on to my belt, Elias said. Trail's a bit rough in places. She gripped the leather of his belt, feeling the solid warmth of him in front of her, and tried to ignore how strange and vulnerable this made her feel. Elias turned his horse away from the Langdon gate without a backward glance. They rode in silence through land that was breathtakingly beautiful and harshly empty at the same time. Rolling grassland stretched in every direction, broken by rocky outcroppings and distant mountains that rose like broken teeth against the sky. The sun beat down relentlessly, but a breeze offered some relief, carrying the scent of sage and dust, and something green she couldn't identify. Margaret had never been west of Philadelphia before this journey. The sheer scale of this land, the vast openness of it, the sense of space that seemed to go on forever, was both terrifying and exhilarating. You get used to it, Elias said, as though reading her thoughts. The bigness. Some people never do. They head back east within a year. But some people find it suits them. Which kind are you? The kind that can't imagine living anywhere else. He guided the horse around a rough patch of ground. Came out here 10 years ago from Ohio. Land was cheap, work was hard, and nobody cared much about who you used to be. Suited me fine. Do you run cattle? Some. Mostly I breed horses. Sell them to ranchers and the army. It's steadier than cattle, and I prefer working with horses anyway. He paused. Gets lonely, though. Place is too quiet sometimes. Margaret didn't answer. She understood loneliness, had lived with it like a constant companion since her father died. But she wasn't sure she was ready to admit that to this stranger whose belt she was holding while his horse carried them both through unfamiliar country. They rode on. The sun moved lower in the sky, the shadows lengthening across the grassland. Margaret's legs began to ache from the unfamiliar position, but she didn't complain. She'd learned early that complaining accomplished nothing. Finally, Elias pointed ahead. That's the place. Margaret looked where he indicated and saw a cluster of buildings nestled in a shallow valley where a creek ran silver between its banks. The main house was modest, a single-story log structure with a covered porch and a stone chimney. Near it stood a barn, a corral, and a few smaller outbuildings. It wasn't grand, it wasn't impressive, but it looked solid and real, built to last rather than to impress. Not much to look at, Elias said, but it's sound. Good water, good grass, room to grow. They rode down into the valley. As they got closer, Margaret could see details. The vegetable garden that had gone mostly to weeds, the windows that needed washing, the porch that needed sweeping. She could also see the good bones underneath the neglect, the tight construction, the careful placement of buildings to take advantage of sunlight and drainage, the well-maintained fences. Elias dismounted in front of the house, then helped Margaret down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, stiff from the long ride. Take a minute, Elias said. I'll get your trunk. Margaret stood still, letting feeling return to her legs, and looked at the house that might become her home. It was so different from anything she'd imagined when she'd answered Victor Langdon's advertisement. Smaller, simpler. Honest in a way the Langdon Ranch, with its ornate gates and obvious wealth, had not been. Elias carried her trunk onto the porch, then pushed open the front door. Come on in. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, but as Margaret's eyes adjusted, she saw a large main room with a stone fireplace at one end and a kitchen area at the other. The furniture was simple but well made. A table with 4 chairs, a worn sofa, a bookshelf with maybe 24 volumes, a desk in the corner. Everything was covered with a thin layer of dust. Dishes were stacked in the dry sink. The floor needed sweeping. But it was clean neglect, not dirty living. The kind of disorder that came from a man working too hard to maintain a house he barely used. Rooms through here, Elias said, leading her to a door off the main room. The bedroom was small but private, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out toward the creek. The bed had a quilt on it, a wedding ring pattern in blues and creams that looked lovingly made but faded with age. "This was my mother's room before she passed," Elias said quietly. "Been empty since. Door locks from the inside. Here's the key." He handed her a small brass key. "Washroom's out back. I'll fill the pitcher for you." Margaret took the key, feeling the weight of it in her palm. A locked door, privacy, safety, simple things that suddenly felt precious. "The house needs work," she said. "Yes, it does. The garden's half dead." "More than half? When did you last have a proper meal?" Elias rubbed the back of his neck. "Define proper." Margaret almost smiled. Almost. "I'll need basic supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, salt, lard, vegetables if you have any that aren't wilted, eggs if your chickens are still laying. Got chickens, got a root cellar with some stores, got a smokehouse with bacon and ham." Elias leaned against the doorframe. "Got pretty much everything except someone who knows how to turn it into something edible." "Then I'll start in the morning." Margaret set her reticule on the chest of drawers. "But first, Mr. Boone, we need that written agreement." "Fair enough." Elias pushed off from the doorframe. "I'll get the paper and pen." They sat at the kitchen table while Margaret wrote out the terms in her careful script: housekeeping duties, cooking, laundry, and general household management in exchange for room, board, and $20 per month. Employment to continue at either party's discretion with 1 week's notice required for termination. Living quarters to remain private and locked. Elias read it over, nodded, and signed his name in a surprisingly elegant hand. Margaret signed below him and felt something settle in her chest. Not quite relief. Not quite hope. But something close to solid ground after a day of feeling like she was falling. "I'll bring in your trunk," Elias said. "Then I'll leave you to settle. There's bread and cheese in the pantry if you're hungry, and the well's out front. Water's cold and clean." "Thank you, Mr. Boone." He paused at the door, looking back at her. "It's Elias. We're going to be living in the same house. Might as well use first names." "Elias, then." Margaret folded the agreement carefully. "And I'm Margaret." He nodded and left, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Margaret sat alone in the quiet house and let herself feel, just for a moment, the full weight of the day. The humiliation at the Langdon gate, the desperation of standing there with nowhere to go, the strange mercy of a man who'd offered help without asking for anything she wasn't willing to give. She didn't know if this would work. She didn't know if Elias Boone was truly as honorable as he seemed, or if this was just another kind of trap with prettier words around it. But she knew she was tired of being afraid, tired of being dependent, tired of making herself small to fit into spaces other people decided she could occupy. Tomorrow she would start earning her keep. She would make this neglected house into a home. Not for Elias, not really, but for herself. Because she'd come west to build a life, and by God, she was going to build one, even if it looked nothing like what she'd imagined. Margaret stood, smoothed her dusty skirts, and went to find that bread and cheese. She was hungry, and hunger was something she knew how to solve. The evening settled over the ranch with soft light that turned the grasslands gold. Through the window, Margaret could see Elias moving around the barn, tending to his horse and whatever other work needed doing before dark. He moved with the kind of competence that came from years of doing the same tasks, economical and sure. She cut thick slices of bread, slightly stale but good quality, and found cheese wrapped in cloth in the pantry. There was butter, too, kept cool in a crock, and when she opened the back door to see the washroom, she found a working pump and fresh water. Margaret ate standing at the kitchen window, watching the man who'd saved her from a desperate situation without asking for gratitude or obligation in return. She didn't trust easily. Life had taught her better than that. But she recognized integrity when she saw it, and Elias Boone had it in the straight line of his shoulders and the way he'd looked Victor Langdon's cruelty in the face and called it what it was. When he came back to the house, she had water heating on the stove. "Thought you'd be resting," he said. "I'll rest when I've washed the dust off." Margaret gestured to the stack of dishes. "Do you have soap?" "You don't need to start tonight. I'm not starting work. I'm washing dishes because I'm going to use them for breakfast, and I prefer them clean." She met his eyes steadily. "There's hot water if you want to wash up too." Elias looked at her for a long moment, and Margaret had the strange sense that he was seeing her, really seeing her, not as a problem to solve or a burden to manage, but as a person with her own will and reasons. "Appreciate it," he said finally. "I'll be quick." They moved around the kitchen in careful orbits, not quite comfortable but not hostile either. Margaret washed the dishes while Elias cleaned the dust from his face and hands at the pump outside, then came back in to make coffee with the kind of focused attention that suggested it might be the one household task he'd truly mastered. "You always ride past the Langdon place?" Margaret asked, scrubbing a plate. "It's on the way back from town. I'd gone in for supplies." Elias poured coffee into 2 tin cups. "Usually I don't see anyone at that gate. Certainly never expected to see someone stranded there." "Lucky for me." "Maybe." He set a cup near her elbow. "Or maybe you'd have figured something else out. You don't strike me as someone who gives up easy." Margaret dried the plate and stacked it with the others. "I don't have the luxury of giving up, Mr. Boone, Elias. Women in my position rarely do." "That how you ended up answering a mail-order advertisement? No other choices?" There was no judgment in the question, just curiosity. "My father died 3 years ago," Margaret said. "He owned a bookshop in Baltimore, but there were debts. I went to live with my aunt as a companion, essentially an unpaid servant disguised as family charity. When she made it clear that arrangement wouldn't last forever, I looked at my options. Find work as a governess or seamstress for poverty wages, or answer advertisements from men looking for wives. And Victor seemed like the best option? He seemed honest. His letters were intelligent, straightforward. He said he wanted a partner, not a decoration. He valued practicality over sentiment." Margaret rinsed the last dish. "Apparently he changed his mind when the reality didn't match his imagination." Elias was quiet for a moment. His loss. The words were simple, but something in the way he said them, matter of fact, without pity or flattery, made Margaret's throat tighten unexpectedly. She dried her hands on a cloth and picked up the coffee he'd poured for her. It was strong and hot and bitter, and it tasted like the first honest thing she'd encountered in Montana. "Thank you," she said. "For the coffee, and for the offer, and for not leaving me at that gate." Elias inclined his head. "You'd have done the same, I expect, if you'd seen someone in trouble." "I'd like to think so." They stood in the kitchen as darkness fell outside, and the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky. Tomorrow, Margaret knew, would bring its own challenges. The work of turning a neglected house into a functioning home, the questions from neighbors who would wonder what a mail-order bride was doing living with a bachelor rancher, the slow process of building trust with a man she barely knew. But tonight, she had a locked door and a roof over her head, and the simple dignity of honest work ahead of her. It was more than she'd had at the Langdon gate. It was enough to start with. "I'll say good night," Margaret said, setting down her empty cup. "Thank you again, Elias. Sleep well, Margaret." She went to her small room and closed the door, turning the key in the lock with hands that were finally steady. Through the window, she could see the last light fading from the sky, the mountains' dark silhouettes against the stars. Margaret Hale had come west to find a new life. This wasn't the life she'd planned, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was the life she needed. She unpacked her trunk in the darkness, hanging her dresses in the small wardrobe and placing her mother's Bible on the chest of drawers. Her hands found the packet of letters from Victor Langdon, and she held them for a moment, feeling the weight of broken promises and wasted hope. Then she carried them to the fireplace in the main room, cold now, but ready for kindling, and placed them carefully on the grate. Tomorrow she would light a fire to cook breakfast, and these letters would be the first thing to burn. Tonight, though, she simply went to bed in a stranger's house and slept more soundly than she had in months, dreaming of open horizons and the smell of sage on the wind. Margaret woke to the sound of a rooster crowing and pale dawn light filtering through the small window. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The room was unfamiliar, the sounds wrong, the air carrying scents of sage and wood smoke instead of Baltimore's coal dust and harbor brine. Then memory returned. The locked gate, the humiliation, Elias Boone's unexpected offer, and the choice she'd made to accept honest work over desperate uncertainty. She dressed quickly in her plainest work dress, a practical gray cotton that had seen her through years of managing her aunt's household, and twisted her hair into a tight knot at the nape of her neck. Through the thin walls, she could hear Elias moving around in the main room, the scrape of the stove door, the clatter of a coffee pot. When she emerged from her room, he was already dressed for the day's work, standing at the stove with his back to her. He turned at the sound of her door. "Morning," he said. Didn't mean to wake you. You didn't. I'm used to early hours. Margaret surveyed the kitchen with a critical eye. In daylight, the neglect was even more apparent. Grease spatters on the wall behind the stove, dried spills on the counter, a general film of dust and disuse over everything. I'll need to know where you keep your cleaning supplies. Back porch. There's soap, brushes, rags. Elias poured coffee into 2 cups. I usually just have coffee for breakfast, but there's eggs and bacon if you want them. I'll cook a proper breakfast for both of us. You work a ranch. You need more than coffee to start the day. Margaret accepted the cup he offered. After that, I'll tackle the kitchen. Is there a day you usually go into town for supplies? Saturdays, mostly. That's 3 days from now. Then I'll make a list of what we need. She sipped the coffee, still strong and bitter the way he'd made it last night. Do you have a budget for household expenses? Elias leaned against the counter, studying her with those quiet eyes. You planning to spend me into poverty? I'm planning to run an efficient household, which requires knowing what resources I have to work with. Margaret met his gaze evenly. I managed my father's bookshop accounts for 5 years, and my aunt's household expenses for 2. I know the value of $1. Spend what you need for basics. I'm not rich, but I'm not poor either. Horses sell well. He finished his coffee in 2 long swallows. I've got to check on the mare in the far pasture. She's close to foaling. I'll be back around noon. I'll have dinner ready. Elias nodded, set his cup in the dry sink, and headed for the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. Margaret, take it slow today. You don't need to fix everything in one morning. Then he was gone, his boots heavy on the porch steps, and Margaret was alone in the quiet house. She stood in the center of the kitchen and felt the challenge of it settle around her shoulders like a familiar weight. This was what she knew how to do. Take chaos and make it order. Take neglect and make it care. Take empty spaces and fill them with purpose. She'd done it in her father's bookshop after her mother died. She'd done it in her aunt's Baltimore townhouse. She would do it here. Margaret rolled up her sleeves and got to work. First, she lit a proper fire in the stove and set water to heat in every pot and kettle she could find. While it heated, she swept the kitchen floor, raising clouds of dust that made her cough, but revealed good pine boards underneath. The windows came next. She scrubbed them inside and out until they sparkled, letting real light into the room for what looked like the first time in months. By the time the water was hot, she'd already worked up a sweat despite the cool morning air. She scrubbed the counters, the table, the stove itself, working with the methodical thoroughness her father had taught her. Start in one corner and work systematically through the space, finishing each task completely before moving to the next. The pantry was better stocked than she'd expected. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, sugar, salt, coffee, even some spices. The root cellar yielded potatoes, onions, and carrots that were starting to sprout but still usable. In the henhouse, she found 8 chickens and collected 6 eggs, speaking softly to the birds the way she'd seen farm women do. She made breakfast from what she found. Eggs fried in bacon fat, thick slices of bacon, potatoes diced and fried until they were crispy and golden, and fresh coffee. It was simple food, but it was hot and plentiful, and when Elias came back at noon, she had it waiting on the table with plates and forks laid out properly. He stopped in the doorway, looking at the transformed kitchen with something like astonishment. "You've been busy." "I told you I'd earn my keep." Margaret gestured to the table. "Sit down before it gets cold." Elias washed his hands at the pump outside, then sat at the table with an air of someone unused to being served. He ate in silence for several minutes, but Margaret noticed he took second helpings of everything. "This is good," he said finally. "Really good. Best meal I've had in this house since my mother died." "How long ago was that?" 2 years. She had a bad winter cold that turned into pneumonia. Elias stared at his plate. "By the time I got the doctor out from town, there wasn't much to be done. She passed 3 days later." "I'm sorry, it's hard, losing a parent." "You said your father died 3 years back?" "Yes." His heart gave out one morning in the shop. He was shelving books, and he just stopped. Margaret refilled their coffee cups. "I found him an hour later." They sat in the kind of silence that acknowledged shared grief without demanding more words. Outside, the ranch yard was quiet, except for the occasional horse whicker and the wind moving through the grass. "The mare had her foal," Elias said eventually. "Healthy colt. Should bring a good price when he's old enough. How many horses do you have? 15 right now. Mix of breeding stock and youngsters I'm training. He pushed his empty plate back. I sell mostly to the army and to ranchers who need working horses. Good. Sound animals that can handle this country. Do you do all the training yourself? Most of it. I hire on a couple of hands during spring and fall when the work's heaviest, but day to day, it's just me. Elias looked around the clean kitchen. And now you. Margaret collected the plates. I'm here to manage the house, not the horses. I know, but it's still different, having someone else around. He stood, carrying his cup to the dry sink. Good different. I didn't realize how quiet it had gotten, until it wasn't anymore. That evening, after Elias had gone back to his work and Margaret had spent the afternoon scrubbing floors and beating dust from the curtains, she stood on the front porch and watched the sun set over the mountains. The sky turned impossible shades of orange and purple and red, colors so vivid they seemed unreal. The land stretched out in every direction, vast and empty, and beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. She heard Elias's footsteps behind her but didn't turn. It's something, isn't it? He said. The sky out here. Never gets old. It's overwhelming. All this space. In Baltimore, you couldn't see more than a block in any direction without buildings blocking the view. You miss it? Margaret considered the question honestly. I miss my father. I miss the bookshop. But Baltimore itself? No, there wasn't anything left for me there except memories and charity I didn't want. Montana's not kind to people who can't adapt, Elias said. Winters are brutal. Summers can be just as hard. It's isolated and the work never stops. Are you trying to scare me away? I'm being honest about what you've signed on for. He leaned against the porch railing. If you decide this isn't for you, I'll take you into town. Make sure you have enough money to get back east. No hard feelings. Margaret turned to look at him directly. I don't scare easily, Elias, and I don't quit when things get difficult. If I leave, it will be because I choose to, not because I'm running from hard work. He smiled slightly. Didn't figure you for a quitter. Just wanted you to know the option exists. They stood together in the gathering darkness, not quite friends, but no longer strangers, and watched the first stars appear. The days developed a rhythm. Margaret rose at dawn, cooked breakfast, then spent her mornings working through the house room by room, scrubbing away months of neglect. The afternoons she devoted to laundry, mending, cooking, and tending the small vegetable garden she was determined to revive. Elias worked from sunup to sundown with his horses, coming in only for meals and the occasional cup of coffee. They spoke during meals, brief conversations about practical matters mostly, though gradually they began to share more. Elias talked about his horses, about the land, about neighbors Margaret hadn't met yet. Margaret found herself describing her father's bookshop, the satisfaction of matching the right book to the right customer, the smell of leather bindings and old paper. You miss it, Elias observed one evening. I miss having something that was mine, something I understood and could control. Margaret stirred the stew she was making for dinner. The bookshop made sense. People came in knowing what they wanted, or I helped them figure it out, and everybody left satisfied. It was simple. Life's not simple, though. No, but books are. They have beginnings and endings, and everything in between follows rules. Elias was quiet for a moment. You ever think about opening another shop? Out here, I mean. With what money? And besides, there aren't enough people in Copper Springs to support a bookshop. Most folks out here are more concerned with survival than literature. Most folks, maybe, but not all. Elias gestured to his small bookshelf. Those are my mother's. She loved to read, taught me to love it too. And I know for a fact there are other people around here who'd appreciate having access to books. Margaret looked at the shelf with new interest. She'd noticed the books but hadn't examined them closely. Now she saw a mix of novels, poetry, and practical volumes, a collection that spoke of someone who read widely and thought deeply. Your mother sounds like she was remarkable. She was. Came out here with my father when this was nothing but grassland and dreams. She made this house a home, made this ranch work when nobody thought it would, and she never complained about how hard it was. Elias's voice was soft with memory. She would have liked you. The words hung in the air between them, unexpectedly intimate. Saturday came, and Elias hitched up the wagon for the trip into Copper Springs. Margaret put on her best dress, still plain by city standards, but clean and carefully pressed, and compiled her supply list with the precision of a military campaign. "You look nervous," Elias said as they headed toward town. "I'm going to be the mail-order bride who got rejected by Victor Langdon and ended up living with you. People will talk." "People always talk. Doesn't mean you have to care about it." "Easy for you to say. You're a man. Your reputation doesn't hang on the same thread mine does." Elias was quiet for a long moment. "You're right. It's not fair, and I'm sorry for making it sound simple." He glanced at her. "But for what it's worth, anyone who questions your character will have to answer to me." Margaret felt something warm unfold in her chest. "I appreciate that, but I can defend my own character." "Never said you couldn't, but there's no rule says you have to do it alone." Copper Springs was larger than Margaret had expected. A proper town with a main street lined with businesses, side streets with neat houses, and enough people moving about to give it a sense of life. Elias drove the wagon to the general store and helped Margaret down. "Take your time," he said. "I've got business at the feed store and the bank. Meet back here in an hour?" Margaret nodded and stepped into the general store with her list in hand and her chin held high. The proprietor was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a sharper smile. "You must be the new housekeeper at the Boone place. I'm Mrs. Callahan. Heard about you from the stage driver." Of course she had. Margaret kept her expression pleasant. "Margaret Hale. I need supplies." "I'm sure you do. That house has been neglected something terrible since poor Mrs. Boone passed." Mrs. Callahan leaned on the counter. "Of course, some folks are wondering why Elias needs a live-in housekeeper. Seems like he managed well enough on his own before." "Managed and thrived are different things," Margaret said coolly. "I'm helping him maintain a proper household. Nothing more, nothing less." "Oh, I'm sure that's all it is." Mrs. Callahan's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Though it does seem convenient, you being the bride Victor Langdon turned away and Elias finding you the same day." Margaret set her list on the counter with deliberate care. "Mrs. Callahan, I'm here to purchase supplies, not to defend my employment. If you'd prefer not to have my business, I'm sure there are other stores in town." The woman's expression shifted, calculation replacing false sweetness. "No need to be hasty. Let's see that list." Margaret got what she needed, paid from the household money Elias had given her, and left the store with her head high and her stomach churning. She'd expected gossip, but experiencing it firsthand still stung. She was loading her purchases into the wagon when a woman approached, younger than Mrs. Callahan, with kind eyes and a genuine smile. "You're Margaret Hale, aren't you? I'm Sarah Chen. My husband and I run the restaurant down the street." She helped Margaret with a heavy bag of flour. "Don't mind Mrs. Callahan. She thinks everyone else's business is her entertainment. I'm discovering that. Listen, Elias Boone is a good man, honest, hardworking, honorable. If he says you're his housekeeper, then that's what you are, and anyone who suggests otherwise is just bored and looking for scandal." Sarah's voice was firm. "You need a friend in this town. You come find me. The Chen restaurant, right on Main Street. You can't miss it." Margaret felt the tightness in her chest ease slightly. "Thank you. That's kind of you." "Not kind, just decent," Sarah smiled. "Besides, any woman who can get Elias to maintain a clean house deserves respect. That man's been living like a bachelor hermit for 2 years." When Elias returned to the wagon, Margaret was feeling steadier. He took one look at her face and frowned. "What happened?" "Nothing I couldn't handle, just the predictable gossip." "Mrs. Callahan?" "Among others." Elias's jaw tightened. "I'll have a word with her." "You will not." Margaret put a hand on his arm. "I fought my own battles in Baltimore, and I'll fight them here. I don't need you charging to my defense like some knight in a dime novel." "Maybe I want to defend you. And maybe I need to defend myself." She met his eyes. "I appreciate the impulse, truly. But if I'm going to live in this territory, I need people to respect me for who I am, not because they're afraid of offending you." Elias looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. But if it gets worse than gossip, if anyone treats you with real disrespect, you tell me." Agreed. They drove back to the ranch in companionable silence, the wagon bed full of supplies and the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders. Margaret found herself studying Elias's profile. The strong line of his jaw, the weathered skin, the capable hands holding the reins with casual expertise. He wasn't handsome in any conventional sense, but there was something solid about him, something trustworthy that went deeper than appearance. "What are you thinking?" he asked without looking at her. "That I made the right choice, coming to work for you. Even with the gossip?" "Especially with the gossip. It means I'm doing something real, something that matters enough for people to notice." Margaret adjusted her bonnet against the sun. "Back in Baltimore, I was invisible. Here, at least I'm visible enough to be talked about." Elias smiled. "That's one way to look at it." That night, after dinner was cleared and the dishes washed, Margaret took one of the books from Elias's shelf, a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman, and carried it to the porch. The evening was cool, the sky turning that impossible purple she was beginning to recognize as Montana's signature color. Elias joined her after a few minutes, carrying his own book. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "It's your porch. It's your evening, too." They sat in comfortable silence, reading as the light faded and the crickets began their nighttime chorus. Margaret couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this particular kind of peace, not the absence of trouble, but the presence of something solid and good underneath the daily challenges. "Margaret?" Elias's voice was quiet. "Yes? I'm glad you're here. I know this wasn't your plan, and I know it's not easy, but I'm glad anyway." Margaret marked her place in the book and looked at him. "I'm glad too. Which is strange, considering how I ended up here. Maybe things work out the way they're supposed to sometimes." "Maybe," she smiled slightly, "though I'm not sure getting rejected at a locked gate was fate so much as Victor Langdon being a coward. His cowardice. My good fortune." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Margaret felt her cheeks warm and was grateful for the darkness that hid her blush. They went back to their reading, but something had shifted between them, some acknowledgement that this arrangement was becoming more than just employer and employee, more than just two people sharing a house out of convenience. The weeks passed, and the ranch began to feel like home. Margaret's garden produced its first vegetables, tender lettuce and quick-growing radishes that she served with pride. The house stayed clean, meals appeared regularly, and Elias's clothes got mended before the tears became holes. In return, Elias brought in fresh meat from hunting, kept the firewood stocked, and fixed the loose board on the porch that had been bothering Margaret since her first week. They developed small rituals, coffee together at dawn before the day's work began, dinner conversations that stretched long past when the food was gone, evening reading on the porch when weather permitted. Margaret learned that Elias had a dry sense of humor that emerged in unexpected moments, that he noticed small details most people missed, that he was capable of surprising gentleness when handling injured animals or frightened horses. Elias learned that Margaret had strong opinions on everything from politics to poetry, that she could calculate numbers in her head faster than most people could with pencil and paper, that she sang softly to herself while cooking and didn't seem to realize she was doing it. Then, 6 weeks after Margaret arrived, Victor Langdon came calling. Margaret was in the garden, harvesting beans, when she heard the horse. She looked up to see a fine black gelding carrying a well-dressed rider approaching the house. She recognized Victor immediately from the photograph he'd sent with his letters. Handsome in a polished way, with dark hair and a carefully trimmed beard. Her stomach dropped. Elias emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his pants. He saw Victor and his expression went very still. "Langdon," he said, his voice neutral. "What brings you out here?" Victor dismounted with practiced elegance. "I came to speak with Miss Hale." He looked past Elias to where Margaret stood among the bean plants. "If I may." "That's up to her." Elias didn't move from his position between Victor and the garden. Margaret set down her basket and walked toward the house, keeping her spine straight and her expression composed. She would not let Victor Langdon see any weakness. "Mr. Langdon," she said when she reached the yard, "this is unexpected. I owe you an apology, Miss Hale." Victor's voice was smooth, practiced. "I treated you abominably. I've come to make amends." "Amends," Margaret repeated flatly. "I was hasty. I made a terrible mistake, and I've regretted it every day since." Victor took a step closer. "I'd like to offer you another chance. Come to the ranch as my wife, as we originally agreed. I'll provide everything I promised: security, comfort, a proper home." Margaret felt Elias tense beside her, but kept her eyes on Victor. "You turned me away without a word of explanation or apology. You left me stranded with nowhere to go and no means to support myself, and now you want me to pretend that never happened? I'm offering you what you came west for, Victor said, a hint of impatience entering his voice. Surely that's worth forgiveness. What I came west for was partnership with an honorable man, Margaret said quietly. You've proven you're not that man. Whatever you're offering now, it comes 6 weeks too late. Victor's expression hardened. You'd rather stay here, working as a servant, than accept my offer. Think carefully, Miss Hale. Boone's ranch is small, his prospects limited. I can give you so much more. You can give me nothing I want, Margaret crossed her arms. I have honest work, fair pay, and a home where I'm treated with respect. That's more than you ever offered. She's made herself clear, Elias said, his voice carrying quiet steel. Time for you to leave. Victor looked between them and something ugly crossed his face. I see. So that's how it is. The desperate mail-order bride and the lonely rancher. Quite convenient for both of you. Elias took a step forward. Watch your mouth, Langdon. Or what? You'll defend her honor? Victor laughed bitterly. Everyone in town knows what this is. They're just too polite to say it to your face. Margaret felt rage bloom hot in her chest, not at the accusation, but at the casual cruelty, the assumption that she had no worth beyond what men decided to give her. Get off this property, she said, her voice cold and clear. You're not welcome here. You're making a mistake, Victor said. The only mistake I made was answering your advertisement in the first place. Margaret gestured toward his horse. Now leave before I ask Elias to help you. Victor mounted his horse stiffly, his face dark with anger and wounded pride. You'll regret this, both of you. He rode away at a gallop, leaving dust and bitter words in his wake. Margaret stood very still, watching him go, feeling her hands shake with anger and something else. Relief, maybe, or clarity. Victor Langdon had offered her exactly what she'd thought she wanted 6 weeks ago, and she'd turned him down without hesitation. You all right? Elias asked softly. Yes. Margaret turned to look at him. Yes, I am. You could have gone with him. I wouldn't have stopped you. I know, but I didn't want to. She took a deep breath. Whatever he's offering, it's not worth the cost. Elias was quiet for a moment. What he said about people talking. Let them talk. I know the truth. You know the truth. That's enough. But that night, alone in her room, Margaret lay awake thinking about Victor's visit and what it meant. She'd rejected security, comfort, and the very future she'd traveled west to claim. In its place, she'd chosen uncertain employment with a man she'd known for 6 weeks, in a territory where gossip could ruin a woman's reputation. She should feel afraid. She should feel foolish. Instead, she felt free. Through the thin walls, she could hear Elias moving around in the main room, his footsteps restless. She wondered if he was thinking about the same things she was, about choices and consequences, about what they were building together in this small house on this big land. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But tonight, Margaret Hale went to sleep knowing she'd made the right choice, even if it was the harder one. And sometimes she was learning the harder choice was the only one worth making. The morning after Victor's visit dawned gray and heavy with the promise of rain. Margaret woke to the sound of thunder rolling across the distant mountains and lay for a moment listening to the storm approach. She'd slept poorly, her dreams tangled with locked gates and angry voices, and she felt the weight of yesterday's confrontation settle over her shoulders like a physical thing. But there was work to be done, and work had always been her salvation. She dressed and emerged to find Elias already up, standing at the window with a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the storm clouds gather. Morning, he said without turning. Going to be a rough one. I need to get the horses into the barn before it hits. I'll help. He looked at her then, surprise flickering across his face. You don't know anything about horses. Then teach me. You can't do everything alone, and I'm tired of being useless outside the house. Margaret poured herself coffee. Besides, if I'm going to live on a ranch, I should know how a ranch works. Elias studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but you do exactly what I say, when I say it. Horses can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. They worked together in the pre-storm stillness, moving the horses from pasture to barn with careful efficiency. Elias showed her how to approach each animal, how to read their body language, how to lead them without fear but with respect. Margaret found herself surprisingly unafraid. The horses were large and powerful, but there was an honesty to them that she appreciated. They didn't lie or manipulate. They simply were. The rain started as they were closing the barn doors. Not a gentle rainfall, but a deluge that came down in sheets, turning the yard to mud within minutes. They ran for the house, laughing breathlessly, and burst through the door soaked to the skin. That, Margaret said, pushing wet hair from her face, was exhilarating. Elias grinned at her, really grinned, and she realized it was the first time she'd seen him look genuinely carefree. You did good out there. Most city women would have been terrified. I'm not most city women. No, he said softly. You're not. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither of them seemed ready to name. Then Margaret turned away, suddenly flustered, and busied herself with stoking the fire. I'll make breakfast. You should change into dry clothes before you catch cold. The storm lasted 3 days, pinning them inside the house together. Margaret cooked, cleaned, and mended while rain drummed on the roof. Elias worked on tack repair, oiled saddles, and read from his small library. They talked more than they ever had before, long conversations that ranged from philosophy to politics to the practical realities of surviving Montana winters. Margaret learned that Elias had come west after his father died, leaving behind a small Ohio farm and a life that had felt too constrained. He'd wanted space, freedom, the chance to build something entirely his own. The ranch had been that dream made real, even when it was hard, even when he was lonely. Elias learned that Margaret had once dreamed of running her own bookshop, that she'd loved the feel of new books and the smell of old ones, that she'd memorized whole poems and could recite them while kneading bread. He learned that she was afraid of very little except becoming dependent on someone who might decide she wasn't worth the trouble. Like Victor did, he said quietly on the third day, when rain still poured and the world beyond the windows was gray water. Like everyone does, eventually. Margaret didn't look up from the shirt she was mending. People tolerate you as long as you're useful. When you stop being useful, they find someone else. Oh, that's a hard way to see the world. It's an honest way. Elias set down the bridle he'd been working on. You think that's how I see you? As useful? Margaret's hand stilled on the fabric. Isn't it? You needed a housekeeper. I needed work. It's a fair exchange. It started that way, Elias admitted. But it's not just that anymore. At least not for me. Margaret finally looked at him, her heart beating too fast. What is it then? I don't know exactly, but I know I look forward to coming in for meals not just because the food is good, but because you're there. I know this house feels alive again in a way it hasn't since my mother died. I know when Victor came offering to take you away, I wanted to tell him to go to hell, not because I need a housekeeper, but because I can't imagine you not being here. Elias ran a hand through his hair, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. Maybe that's still just usefulness, but it feels like more. Margaret set aside her mending with shaking hands. I turned Victor down because the thought of leaving here made me feel sick. Not because I was afraid of him or didn't want security, but because this... She gestured at the small, cozy room, the storm outside, the life they'd built together. This feels right in a way nothing else ever has, and that terrifies me. Why? Because I don't trust it. Because good things don't last, not for people like me. People like you, Elias repeated. You mean people who've been disappointed before? I mean people who aren't quite enough. Not pretty enough, not charming enough, not worth keeping. The words came out raw and honest, stripped of pride. My father loved me, but he died. My aunt tolerated me, but only until it was inconvenient. Victor wanted me, but only until he saw me in person. I'm always almost enough, Elias. Never quite. He stood and crossed to where she sat, kneeling down so they were eye to eye. You listen to me, Margaret Hale. You are more than enough. You're smart and strong and capable of things most people never even attempt. You crossed a country to start over. You stood up to humiliation with dignity. You've turned a neglected house into a home and made me remember what it feels like to have someone to talk to at the end of a long day. His voice was fierce now, intense. If other people couldn't see your worth, that's their failure, not yours. Margaret felt tears burning behind her eyes, the first tears she'd shed since standing at Victor's gate. You barely know me. I know enough. And what I know, I value. He took her hand carefully, as though she might break. I'm not asking for promises or commitments. I'm just saying you're not alone in feeling like this might be something more than a business arrangement." She looked at their joined hands, his calloused and strong, hers reddened from work, and felt something crack open in her chest. Not breaking, but opening. Like a door she'd kept locked was finally willing to swing wide. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "Do what?" "Trust that this is real, that you mean what you're saying, that tomorrow you won't change your mind. Then I'll just have to keep showing you." Elias squeezed her hand gently. "Every day, until you believe it." The storm broke that night, and the next morning dawned clear and washed clean. Margaret woke feeling as though something fundamental had shifted, as though the world had rearranged itself while she slept. She dressed and went to the kitchen to find Elias already making coffee, and when he smiled at her, she felt warmth spread through her chest like sunrise. They worked together that morning, mucking out the barn and checking the fence lines damaged by the storm. Margaret's hands blistered from the unfamiliar work, but she didn't complain. She was learning the rhythm of ranch life, the endless cycle of maintenance and care that kept everything running. At noon, a rider approached, a young man Margaret didn't recognize, carrying a message for Elias. "Fire at the Henderson place," the rider said breathlessly. "Started in the barn, spread to the house. They're asking all able men to come help." Elias was already moving toward his horse. "How bad?" "Bad enough. They've got 3 kids, and Mrs. Henderson is pregnant again. They need all the help they can get." "I'm coming." Elias turned to Margaret. "I don't know when I'll be back. Could be tonight, could be tomorrow. Don't wait up." "Be careful," Margaret said, and hated how frightened she sounded. He paused, came back to her, and touched her face briefly, a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. "I will. Promise." Then he was gone, riding hard toward the Henderson ranch with the messenger, and Margaret was alone in the sudden quiet. She spent the day working to keep her mind occupied, baking bread, doing laundry, weeding the garden. But as afternoon stretched into evening and evening into night, fear began to creep in. Fire was one of the deadliest threats in this country, where everything was dry and wooden and far from help. Men died fighting fires, burned or crushed by falling timbers, or simply overcome by smoke. Margaret sat on the porch as darkness fell, watching the road, and finally admitted to herself what she'd been denying for weeks. She was in love with Elias Boone. Not the desperate, grasping love of someone who needed rescue. Not the practical affection she'd tried to cultivate for Victor through his letters. But something deeper and truer. The kind of love built on respect and shared work and the slow revelation of another person's character. She loved his quietness and his strength. She loved the way he treated his horses with gentle respect and his land with careful stewardship. She loved that he'd seen her stranded and offered help without asking for anything in return. She loved the way he listened when she talked, the way he challenged her assumptions, the way he made her feel seen and valued. And the thought of him being hurt, of losing him before she'd even had the courage to admit what she felt, made her feel like she was suffocating. Margaret sat on that porch until past midnight, wrapped in a quilt, watching the stars wheel overhead and praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in any more that Elias would come home safe. He rode in just before dawn, exhausted and covered in soot. Margaret heard the horse and flew off the porch, her heart in her throat. "You're hurt," she said, seeing the burns on his hands, the raw patch on his neck. "It's nothing. Henderson's barn is gone, but we saved the house and the animals. Everyone's safe." Elias swayed slightly in the saddle, and Margaret realized he was dead on his feet. She helped him down, supported his weight as they walked to the house. "Sit. I'll get water and bandages." "Margaret, I'm fine." "Sit down, Elias Boone, before you fall down." He sat. Margaret worked with steady hands, cleaning the burns, applying salve, wrapping his hands in clean bandages. Elias watched her face the whole time, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You were worried," he said finally. "Of course I was worried. Fire is dangerous, and you were gone all night, and I—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "You what?" Margaret met his eyes. "I realized I care about you. More than I should, probably. More than is wise, given that I work for you and we've only known each other a few months, and this whole situation is already complicated enough without—" Elias reached up with his bandaged hand and touched her face, silencing her. "Margaret, stop talking for 1 second." She stopped. "I'm in love with you. he said simply. Have been for weeks, probably. Maybe since the day I saw you standing at that gate with your chin up and your eyes full of fire. I know it's too soon. I know we haven't known each other long, but I also know I've never felt this way about anyone, and I don't want to waste time pretending I don't. Margaret felt tears spill over, hot on her cheeks. I don't know how to do this, how to trust this. Then we'll figure it out together. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her despite the bandages, and she buried her face against his shoulder and let herself cry. For all the years of feeling unwanted, for the fear of the long night, for the overwhelming relief of having him home safe, for the terrifying joy of being loved. I need time, she said against his shirt. I need to know this is real and not just convenience or loneliness or take all the time you need, Elias said. I'm not going anywhere. They sat there as dawn broke, holding each other in the quiet kitchen, and something settled between them that felt like the beginning of something permanent. The next weeks were different. There was a new awareness between them, a tenderness that hadn't been there before. Elias found excuses to touch her hand when passing dishes at meals. Margaret caught herself watching him work and smiling for no reason. They still maintained the boundaries of propriety, separate rooms, careful distance, but underneath ran a current of understanding that this was heading somewhere neither of them had quite the courage to name yet. The town noticed, of course. When Margaret went to Copper Springs with Elias the following Saturday, Mrs. Callahan's knowing smile made her want to scream, but Sarah Chen pulled her aside in the restaurant and squeezed her hand. I'm happy for you both, Sarah said quietly. Elias deserves someone good, and so do you. Nothing's been decided, Margaret protested. Maybe not out loud, but anyone with eyes can see how he looks at you and how you look at him. That's not employer and employee. That's something real. Margaret couldn't deny it. 2 weeks later, Victor Langdon tried one more time. He rode up to the ranch in the late afternoon, dismounting with the same elegant grace, but this time his expression was harder, more calculating. Miss Hale, he said, I'd like to speak with you, privately. Margaret, who was feeding the chickens, straightened and brushed grain dust from her hands. Anything you have to say, you can say in front of Elias. Elias had emerged from the barn at the sound of hooves, and now he stood beside Margaret with crossed arms. Victor's smile was thin. Very well. I'm prepared to make you a better offer. Marry me, and I'll settle $1,000 on you immediately. You'll have your own money, complete independence within the marriage. You can even keep working with Boone's horses if that's what you enjoy. No, Margaret said simply. You haven't heard the full offer? I don't need to. The answer is no. Victor's mask slipped, showing the anger beneath. You're a fool. You could have security, wealth, position. Instead, you're playing house with a man who barely makes enough to keep this pathetic ranch running. This pathetic ranch is an honest living built with hard work, Margaret said, her voice cold. Unlike your wealth, which came from your father's investments and the labor of men you underpay. And Elias is worth 10 of you in every way that matters. You're choosing him? Victor's voice was incredulous. A dirt-poor horse rancher over everything I can give you? I'm choosing dignity over wealth. I'm choosing partnership over being owned. I'm choosing a man who sees me as an equal over one who sees me as property. Margaret stepped closer to Elias, and his arm came around her shoulders immediately. And yes, I'm choosing Elias. Every time, without question. Elias pulled her closer, his voice rough with emotion. You heard her, Victor. Leave. This is your final answer? Victor asked Margaret. This was my final answer the first time you asked. Now it's just getting tiresome. Victor mounted his horse stiffly. You'll regret this, both of you. When winter comes and you're struggling to heat this place, when you realize what you've given up for some romantic notion of true love, you'll remember I offered you better. I doubt I'll think of you at all, Margaret said. He rode away, and this time Margaret knew he wouldn't be back. She'd rejected him completely, chosen Elias openly, and burned every bridge that might have led back to the life Victor represented. She felt Elias's arms tighten around her. You meant that? He asked. About choosing me? Margaret turned in his embrace to face him directly. Every word. I choose you, Elias. Not because you're convenient or because I have no other options, but because you're the best man I've ever known. Because when I think about my future, I can't imagine it without you in it. Because, she took a shaking breath, because I love you, His kiss was gentle and fierce at the same time, full of months of restrained longing finally released. Margaret kissed him back with everything she had, pouring years of loneliness and fear and hope into this moment, this man, this choice. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elias rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "Not as employer and employee, not as convenience, but as partners. Equal partners in everything, the ranch, the life, all of it. Marry me because you want to, because you choose to, because you can't imagine anything else either." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face again, but this time they were joyful. "Yes, God, yes." He kissed her again, then pulled back with a slightly sheepish expression. "I don't have a ring. I don't have much of anything fancy to offer you." "I don't want fancy. I want real." Margaret touched his face, tracing the weathered lines she'd come to know so well. "I want this. You and me, and this ranch, and the life we'll build together. That's all I've ever wanted, even when I didn't know it." They stood there in the yard as the sun set, holding each other, and for the first time in her life, Margaret Hale felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. That night they sat on the porch, Margaret's hand in Elias's, and talked about the future. They would marry as soon as the circuit preacher came through next month. Margaret would become a full partner in the ranch, not just the housekeeper. They would expand the horse operation, maybe build a second barn, plant a bigger garden. They would face the brutal Montana winter together and emerge stronger on the other side. "Are you afraid?" Elias asked. "Of what people will say?" "Let them say what they want. I know the truth, that I stood at a locked gate with nothing, and you offered me everything that matters. That I came west looking for security and found something better. That the best decision I ever made was accepting work from a quiet rancher who saw me when I was invisible to everyone else." "I'm the one who's fortunate," Elias said. "You could have gone back east, could have accepted Victor's money. Instead, you stayed and made this house a home, and reminded me what it feels like to have someone to share life with." "We saved each other," Margaret said softly. "That's the truth of it. You saved me from desperation, and I saved you from loneliness. Now we get to build something new together." He kissed her hand. "I love you, Margaret Hale. Soon to be Margaret Boone. I love you too. And Elias?" She smiled. "Thank you for riding past that gate. Best decision I ever made." They sat together as stars filled the sky. Two people who'd found each other at the worst possible moment and turned it into the beginning of everything good. The wind carried the scent of sage and rain, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called. Margaret leaned her head on Elias's shoulder and felt completely, perfectly at peace. This was home. This was love. This was the life she'd traveled 2,000 miles to find, even though she hadn't known what she was looking for until she found it. And tomorrow, when the work began again, they would face it together, as partners, as equals, as two people who'd chosen each other freely and completely. That was worth more than all Victor Langdon's money could ever buy. The circuit preacher arrived on a Thursday in late September, riding into Copper Springs with his Bible and his worn saddlebags, and news that he'd only be staying 2 days before moving on to the next settlement. Margaret and Elias rode into town that afternoon to speak with him, and by sunset their wedding was scheduled for Saturday morning at the small church on the edge of town. Margaret had imagined this moment differently when she'd answered Victor's advertisement. A formal ceremony, perhaps, with strangers playing the role of family, carefully orchestrated to present the proper image. Instead, she would marry Elias in a simple service with whatever neighbors chose to attend, wearing her best dress because she had nothing finer, speaking vows that meant everything because they were freely chosen. "You're sure about this?" Elias asked as they drove the wagon back to the ranch under a sky full of stars. "We could wait, have something bigger, invite people." "I don't want bigger. I don't want to wait." Margaret shifted closer to him on the wagon seat. "I want to marry you, Elias. The sooner, the better." He smiled and wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "Then Saturday it is." Friday passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret baked bread and pies for the small gathering they'd have at the ranch afterward. She pressed her blue dress, the nicest thing she owned, simple but well made, and washed her hair until it shone. Elias rode to the Henderson place to invite them, and stopped at 2 other neighboring ranches to spread the word. He came back with the news that at least a dozen people planned to attend. "Sarah Chen says she's bringing food," he reported, "and Mrs. Henderson insisted on making a cake. I think half the valley is excited about this wedding. Or curious, Margaret said dryly. The rejected mail-order bride marrying the rancher who took her in. It's probably the most interesting thing to happen around here in months. Let them be curious. Let them come see that we're choosing each other for the right reasons. Elias caught her hand and pulled her close. I'm not ashamed of how we started, Margaret, and I'm proud of where we've ended up. She kissed him softly. So am I. That night, Margaret lay awake in her small room, listening to the house settle around her and thinking about everything that had changed since the day she'd stood at Victor Langdon's locked gate. She'd been so certain then about what she wanted: security, stability, a clear role in a household where she'd be valued for her usefulness. She'd been willing to marry a stranger for those things, to build a life on practical foundations rather than romantic dreams. But what she'd found with Elias was something entirely different. Not security built on his wealth or position, but partnership built on mutual respect. Not stability that came from following someone else's rules, but the kind that grew from two people working side by side toward common goals. She'd found love, yes, but more than that, she'd found herself reflected in someone else's eyes and recognized as worthy, not despite her sharp edges and strong opinions, but because of them. Tomorrow she would stand before God and neighbors and promise herself to this man who'd saved her not by rescuing her, but by offering her the chance to save herself. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with a quiet, bone-deep certainty that this was exactly right. Saturday morning dawned clear and cool, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed designed for new beginnings. Margaret dressed with care, braiding her hair and pinning it up, fastening the small pearl earrings that had been her mother's. When she emerged from her room, Elias was waiting in his Sunday suit, dark and slightly worn but clean and pressed. He stared at her. "You're beautiful," he said, his voice rough. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm presentable." "You're beautiful," he repeated firmly. "Always have been. Just took you a while to believe I could see it." They rode to town in the wagon, sitting close, not speaking much. Words seemed unnecessary. Everything that mattered had already been said. The small church was fuller than Margaret had expected. She recognized the Hendersons, Tom with his quiet smile and his wife Emma, heavy with child. Sarah and James Chen stood near the front, Sarah beaming. There were ranchers and their wives, people Margaret had seen in town but never formally met. Even Mrs. Callahan from the general store had come, though her expression suggested she was there more for gossip than celebration. And standing in the back, alone and rigid, was Victor Langdon. Margaret felt Elias tense beside her. "Ignore him," she whispered. "He doesn't matter. He shouldn't be here. Let him watch. Let him see exactly what he lost." The preacher was a weathered man in his 60s with kind eyes and a voice that carried easily through the small space. He spoke briefly about the sanctity of marriage, about partnership and commitment, about building lives together on foundations of faith and mutual respect. Then he turned to Elias and Margaret. "Elias Boone, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Elias said clearly, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "Margaret Hale, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Margaret thought about the gate where she'd stood alone and desperate. She thought about the choice she'd made to accept Elias's offer, and every choice that had followed. She thought about love earned through shared work and honest conversation, about finding home in the last place she'd expected. "I do," she said, and her voice was steady and sure. Elias slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. His mother's ring, he'd told her, kept safe for years until he found someone worthy to wear it. Margaret had no ring to offer in return, but Elias had said it didn't matter, that she was enough. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher said. "You may kiss your bride." Elias cupped Margaret's face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made her throat tight. Around them, people clapped and called out congratulations, but Margaret barely heard them. She was too focused on this moment, this man, this irrevocable commitment they'd just made to each other. When they finally broke apart, she was smiling so hard her face hurt. They walked back down the aisle together, and Margaret saw Victor still standing in the back, his expression unreadable. As they passed, he spoke quietly, just loud enough for them to hear. I hope you know what you're doing. Margaret stopped and looked at him directly. I do. For the first time in my life, I absolutely do. Then she and Elias walked out into the sunlight as husband and wife, leaving Victor and his bitterness behind. The gathering at the ranch afterward was simple but joyful. People brought food, roasted chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from autumn gardens, pies and cakes. Sarah Chen had made a beautiful layered cake with white frosting, and Emma Henderson had embroidered a set of dish towels as a gift. They're lovely, Margaret said, touched by the thoughtfulness. Every home needs good dish towels, Emma said with a smile. And you've made that house a real home, Margaret. Elias is fortunate to have you. I'm the fortunate one, Margaret replied, and meant it. Tom Henderson pulled Elias aside, and Margaret saw them talking seriously near the barn. When Elias returned, he was frowning slightly. Everything all right? Margaret asked. Tom says Victor's been asking questions around town. About us? About the ranch? About how much debt I'm carrying. Margaret felt cold despite the warm afternoon. Why would he do that? I don't know, but it's not good. Elias rubbed the back of his neck. Victor owns the bank in Copper Springs. If he wanted to cause trouble, he could. We haven't done anything wrong. Doesn't matter. He's got money and influence, and we've got neither. Elias pulled her close. I won't let him hurt you, Margaret. Whatever he's planning, we'll face it together. The celebration continued until sunset, when neighbors began heading home to tend their own animals and complete their own chores. Sarah hugged Margaret tightly before leaving. You two are going to be very happy, she said. I can see it. Don't let anyone make you doubt that. Finally, Margaret and Elias were alone in their home. Truly their home now. Not employer and employee, but husband and wife. The significance of it settled over Margaret like a warm blanket. Elias built up the fire while Margaret cleared the last of the dishes. They moved around each other with the easy familiarity of months of shared space, but underneath ran a new current of awareness, of possibility. I'm going to check the horses one more time, Elias said. Make sure everything's settled for the night. Margaret nodded, understanding he was giving her time to prepare, to adjust to this new reality. While he was gone, she changed into her nightgown and wrapper, unpinned her hair, and sat brushing it out by the fire. Her hands were shaking slightly. When Elias returned, he stopped in the doorway, watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. Come here, she said softly. He crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair. Are you afraid? A little, Margaret admitted. Not of you, just of everything changing. It doesn't have to change all at once. Elias took the brush from her hands and began running it gently through her hair. We can take our time, learn each other. There's no rush. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the gentle tug of the brush, the warmth of his presence. I love you, Elias Boone. I love you too, Margaret Boone. The name made her smile. Margaret Boone. No longer Margaret Hale, the rejected mail-order bride. She was someone new now, someone who belonged here, who'd been chosen, and who'd chosen in return. That night they came together slowly, tenderly, learning the landscape of each other's bodies with careful hands and whispered words. Margaret had been afraid of this intimacy, had worried she wouldn't know what to do or how to be. But Elias made it easy. He was patient and gentle, and so clearly focused on her comfort that her fear gradually gave way to curiosity, then to desire, then to a pleasure that left her breathless and amazed. Afterward, lying in Elias's arms in the bed that was now theirs, Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks. Did I hurt you? Elias asked immediately, concerned. No, God, no. She turned to face him. I just never thought I could have this. Any of this. I thought I'd spend my whole life making do, settling for less, being grateful for scraps. And now I have everything. He kissed her forehead. We have everything, together. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and Margaret dreamed of open horizons and endless possibilities. The next week settled into a new rhythm. Margaret was no longer just the housekeeper, but Elias's partner in every sense. They worked together on the ranch, Margaret learning more about the horses and the business side of breeding and selling. Elias taught her to ride properly, and she discovered she loved the freedom of it, the way the world opened up when you could travel fast across open land. In town, the gossip gradually shifted. People stopped whispering about the mail-order bride and the lonely rancher and started talking about the Boones, the young couple working hard to build their ranch, The woman who'd brought life back to the Boone place, the man who'd found himself a real partner. But Victor Langdon's shadow still loomed. It came to a head in late October when the bank sent a notice demanding immediate payment on a loan Elias had taken out 2 years earlier to purchase breeding stock. The loan wasn't due for another 6 months, but the notice claimed a clause allowed the bank to call it in early if they deemed the borrower a risk. "This is Victor," Elias said, staring at the notice with barely controlled fury. "He's using the bank to force us into a corner." Margaret read the document carefully. "How much do we owe?" $800. "I've been paying it down steadily, but I don't have that much cash on hand. Most of our capital is tied up in horses." "Could we sell some?" "Not quickly enough. And not in this market without taking a loss." Elias paced the kitchen. "Victor knows exactly what he's doing. If we can't pay, he can foreclose on the ranch. We'd lose everything." Margaret felt rage building in her chest, white-hot and clarifying. "There has to be a way to fight this. Not against the bank, not against Victor's money and influence." "Then we go to him directly," Margaret said. "We confront him and make it clear this stops now." "Margaret, no. I won't let him destroy what we've built because his pride was wounded. I rejected him, and he needs to accept it and move on." Elias studied her face. "You want to talk to him?" "I want to finish this. Once and for all." They rode to the Langdon Ranch the next morning, Margaret's spine straight and her jaw set. The ornate gate was open this time, and they rode through it up to the impressive house she'd never entered. Victor met them on the front porch, his expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Boone," he said, emphasis on the title. "And Elias. What brings you here?" "You know exactly why we're here," Margaret said, dismounting without waiting for help. "The loan you're calling in early. This harassment needs to stop. I'm simply exercising the bank's rights under the loan agreement. Nothing personal." "Everything about this is personal, and we all know it." Margaret climbed the porch steps until she was at eye level with him. "You're angry because I chose Elias over you, but that's not a good enough reason to try to destroy our lives." "You could have had everything I offered," Victor said, his composure cracking slightly. "Wealth, position, security. Instead, you chose poverty and hard labor with a man who can barely keep his ranch afloat." "I chose love," Margaret said flatly. "I chose partnership and respect and honesty, things you've never understood and apparently never will." "Love doesn't pay mortgages. It doesn't survive harsh winters or failed harvests or the 1,000 small disasters that destroy ranches every year." "Maybe not, but it's still worth more than all your money." Margaret leaned forward. "Here's what's going to happen, Victor. You're going to restore that loan to its original terms. You're going to leave us alone. And you're going to accept that I made my choice and it wasn't you." Victor laughed bitterly. "Or what? What leverage do you possibly have?" "The truth," Margaret said quietly. "About why you rejected me in the first place. About what really happened that day." Victor's face went very still. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Your foreman told me, eventually. You didn't reject me because you'd changed your mind about wanting a wife. You rejected me because your friends saw my photograph and laughed. Because they said you were ordering a bride like you'd order livestock, and when they saw what you'd picked, they mocked you for it." Margaret's voice was steady and cold. "You were embarrassed, Victor, so you threw me away like garbage rather than stand up to their judgment." "That's a lie." "Is it? Because I'm willing to tell that story to everyone in Copper Springs. I'm willing to let people know that Victor Langdon, the powerful banker, is so weak he let his friends dictate his personal life. That he's so petty he'd try to ruin a man's livelihood because his pride was hurt." Elias had come to stand beside her, and now he spoke quietly. "You call in that loan, Victor, and everyone will know why. We'll make sure of it. Your reputation as a fair banker will be destroyed." Victor's face had gone pale, then red with anger. "You're bluffing." "Try me," Margaret said. "I've got nothing to lose except a ranch that you're already trying to take. But you? You've got your whole carefully constructed image to protect. What do you think people will respect more? My honesty about how we started, or your petty revenge?" The silence stretched long and tense. Finally, Victor spoke through gritted teeth. "The loan will be restored to its original terms." "In writing," Margaret said. "Today." "Fine." Victor turned and went into the house, returning moments later with paperwork. He scrawled a note canceling the early payment demand and thrust it at Elias. There. Now, get off my property. Margaret took the paper, folded it carefully, and tucked it into her pocket. Thank you. And Victor? This is the last time we'll speak. Leave us alone, and we'll do the same for you. They rode away from the Langdon ranch in silence, and it wasn't until they were back on their own land that Elias finally spoke. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen. Margaret was shaking now that the confrontation was over, adrenaline draining away. I couldn't let him win. I couldn't let him take this from us. Elias pulled his horse close to hers and reached for her hand. We make a good team, Mrs. Boone. We do, don't we? That night, secure in the knowledge that Victor's threat had been neutralized, they sat on the porch and watched the stars come out. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the promise of winter to come, but Margaret felt nothing but warm. You know what I realized today, she said. What? Standing at that gate when Victor rejected me was the best thing that ever happened to me. If he'd let me in, I'd be living in that big house right now, comfortable and secure and completely miserable. I'd never have met you, never have learned what real partnership feels like, never have found home. Elias pulled her closer. I've thought the same thing. If you hadn't been standing there that day, if I'd ridden past 5 minutes earlier or later, I'd still be alone in this house, barely living. You gave me my life back, Margaret. We saved each other, she said, echoing words from weeks earlier. And now we're building something new, something that's completely ours. What do you want to build? Elias asked. Really, if you could have anything. Margaret thought about it, looking out over the land they'd defended together, the home they were creating. I want to expand the horse operation. I want a garden big enough to sell produce in town. I want children, eventually, when we're ready. I want to grow old here with you, watching this place thrive because we built it together with our own hands and our own sweat. That sounds perfect to me. What do you want? Everything you just said, Elias replied. And maybe, someday, to see you open that bookshop you used to dream about. Even a small one, in Copper Springs. You'd be good at it. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. You'd support that? I'd support anything that makes you happy. That's what partnership means. They sat together as the night deepened, making plans and dreaming dreams. Two people who'd found each other at the worst possible moment and turned it into the foundation of everything good. The future stretched before them, full of hard work and uncertainty, but also full of possibility. And for the first time in her life, Margaret Boone wasn't afraid of what came next, because whatever it was, they would face it together. Winter came to Montana Territory with a vengeance that year, arriving early in November with snow that piled waist deep and temperatures that made the air itself feel sharp enough to cut. Margaret had never experienced cold like this. Baltimore winters were mild by comparison. Just enough frost to make mornings unpleasant, but never this bone-deep chill that turned breath to ice crystals and made every outdoor task an endurance test. But she and Elias had prepared well. The root cellar was stocked with vegetables and preserved goods. The barn held enough hay to feed the horses through the worst of it. The woodpile stood tall against the house, and they'd chinked every gap in the walls to keep the wind out. They were ready, or as ready as anyone could be for a Montana winter. The first real blizzard hit 3 weeks before Christmas. It came howling out of the north in the middle of the night, wind screaming around the house, and snow driving so thick you couldn't see 3 feet in any direction. Margaret woke to Elias already dressing in the darkness. The horses, he said tersely. I need to make sure they're secure in the barn. I'm coming with you. Margaret, it's dangerous. Which is exactly why you shouldn't go alone. She was already pulling on layers of clothing, wool stockings, and her heaviest dress, then Elias's spare coat over it all. We're partners, remember? That means we face things together. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Stay close to me. Hold on to my belt and don't let go, no matter what. They roped themselves together and pushed out into the storm. The wind hit Margaret like a physical blow, stealing her breath and nearly knocking her off her feet. Snow stung her face and blinded her instantly. She gripped Elias's belt with both hands and followed him into the whiteout, trusting him completely. The journey to the barn, usually a simple 50-yard walk, became an epic struggle. They fought for every step, the wind trying to push them off course, the snow already deep enough to make walking treacherous. Margaret's face went numb within minutes, her fingers aching even inside thick gloves. Finally, they reached the barn. Elias hauled the door open against the wind, and they stumbled inside into relative shelter. The horses were restless, spooked by the storm, but safe and secure. Elias moved among them with calm efficiency, checking each one, speaking in low, soothing tones, making sure water hadn't frozen and feed was accessible. Margaret helped as best she could, her hands clumsy with cold, but her determination fierce. This was her life now, her responsibility. These horses represented their livelihood, their future. She would protect them just as fiercely as Elias did. "We might need to stay here until the worst passes," Elias said, surveying the storm through gaps in the barn walls. "Could be hours before it's safe to go back to the house." "Then we stay." They made a nest in the hay, wrapping themselves in horse blankets and huddling close for warmth. The barn creaked and groaned under the assault of the wind, but the structure held. The horses gradually settled, reassured by human presence. Margaret pressed against Elias's side, sharing body heat, listening to the storm rage outside. "Is it always like this?" "Sometimes worse. Winter of '78, we had a blizzard that lasted 4 days straight. Lost half the territory's cattle that year." Elias's arm tightened around her. "But we'll be all right. We're prepared, and we're together." "I'm not afraid," Margaret said, and realized it was true. The storm was terrifying, the cold brutal, the situation dangerous. But she wasn't afraid. Not with Elias beside her. Not in this life they'd built together. "I know you're not. You're the bravest person I've ever met." They waited out the storm in the barn, dozing fitfully, checking on the horses, sharing the simple meal Margaret had thought to grab before they left, bread and cheese and dried apples. The blizzard screamed for hours, then gradually began to ease as dawn approached. By full daylight, the wind had dropped to a manageable level, and the snow had stopped falling. They emerged from the barn to a transformed world. Snow lay in massive drifts, sculpted by the wind into fantastic shapes. The sky was clearing to pale blue, and the sun sparkled off the snow with blinding brightness. It was beautiful and deadly in equal measure. The house was half buried, but they dug their way to the door and stumbled inside, exhausted and frozen. Margaret built up the fire while Elias stripped off wet outer layers. They heated water for coffee and stood close to the stove, thawing gradually. "Welcome to your first Montana blizzard," Elias said with a tired smile. "I survived it." "You did more than survive. You helped save the horses. That took courage." Margaret warmed her hands around her coffee cup. "I told you I wasn't a quitter." "No," Elias said softly. "You're definitely not that." The winter deepened, and with it came both challenges and unexpected joys. Margaret learned to navigate snow that never seemed to melt, to cope with darkness that lasted 16 hours a day, to find beauty in stark landscapes and frost patterns on windows. She learned the rhythm of winter ranch work, the endless cycle of feeding animals, hauling water before it could freeze, chopping wood, maintaining equipment. But she also discovered the intimacy of long winter evenings spent by the fire, reading aloud to each other from Elias's small library, the pleasure of cooking hearty meals that filled the house with warmth and good smells, the deep satisfaction of working alongside someone who valued her contribution, who never dismissed her ideas or treated her like a fragile decoration. And in late December, she discovered something else. She'd been feeling unwell for a week, queasy in the mornings, tired in ways that didn't match her exertion. At first she blamed it on the cold, on the endless winter darkness, on the heavy foods they ate to stay warm. But when her monthly courses didn't come and her breasts became tender, realization dawned. She was pregnant. Margaret stood alone in the kitchen, one hand pressed to her still flat stomach, feeling joy and terror in equal measure. A baby. She was going to have a baby. Elias's baby. The thought was overwhelming. She told him that night as they sat by the fire, her heart pounding. "I think I'm pregnant," she said simply. Elias's book dropped from his hands. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor. All the signs are there." He crossed to where she sat and knelt in front of her, taking her hands. "How do you feel about it?" "Terrified, excited, completely unprepared." Margaret met his eyes. "How do you feel?" "The same. All of those things." Elias placed his hand gently over her stomach. "A baby. Our baby. Are you happy?" He paused, searching for words. "I'm amazed. I never thought I'd have this. A wife I love, a child on the way, a real family. It's more than I ever let myself hope for. Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks. I'm afraid I won't be a good mother, that I won't know what to do. Then we'll figure it out together, just like we've figured out everything else. Elias pulled her close. We've survived blizzards and threats and starting over from nothing. We can handle a baby. Can we? We can handle anything, Margaret. Don't you know that by now? She laughed through her tears and held him tight, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steadiness that had become her anchor. They would figure it out. They always did. The news spread through the valley with the speed of all gossip in isolated communities. When Margaret and Elias made the trek into Copper Springs in late January during a break in the weather, people congratulated them with genuine warmth. Even Mrs. Callahan managed something close to sincerity. A baby's a blessing, she said, especially out here where life can be hard. Children remind you what you're working for. Sarah Chen hugged Margaret fiercely. I'm so happy for you both. And if you need anything, advice, help, anything at all, you just ask. But it was Emma Henderson who pulled Margaret aside and spoke the truth others danced around. Having a baby out here isn't easy, she said quietly, especially in winter. You'll need help when your time comes, and the doctor might not be able to get through if the weather's bad. I know, Margaret said. I'm trying not to think about it too much. Don't be afraid to think about it. Be prepared. Emma squeezed her hand. I'll help you. Sarah will help. We women look after each other out here because we have to. You're not alone in this. The words brought unexpected comfort. Margaret had spent so much of her life being alone, fending for herself, that the idea of a community of women supporting each other felt almost foreign. But she was learning that Montana, for all its harshness, bred a different kind of person. People who understood that survival meant cooperation. That in a land this brutal, you helped your neighbors because someday you'd need help in return. Winter finally began to ease in March, the days growing perceptibly longer, the cold losing some of its savage edge. Snow still covered the ground, but it was wet snow now, melting in the sun and refreezing at night. Margaret was 5 months pregnant, her belly beginning to round noticeably, and she felt the baby move for the first time on a morning when she was kneading bread. Elias, she called, and he came running from the barn, alarmed. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. The baby moved. Here. She grabbed his hand and pressed it to her stomach. Wait, there. Elias's face transformed with wonder as he felt the tiny flutter of movement beneath his palm. That's our child. That's our child, Margaret agreed, and they stood together in the kitchen, connected by this small miracle they'd created. Spring arrived properly in April, the snow melting in earnest, the creek swelling with runoff, the first green shoots appearing in Margaret's garden. She worked carefully now, mindful of the life she carried, but she refused to be coddled. There was too much to do. Seeds to plant, the house to clean after months of being shuttered against the cold, equipment to repair and prepare for the season ahead. Elias had hired on 2 hands for the spring work, young men who lived in the bunkhouse and helped with the horses. Margaret cooked for all of them, enjoying the challenge of feeding hungry workers, the satisfaction of seeing them clean their plates and come back for seconds. You're a fine cook, Mrs. Boone, one of them said shyly. Best meals I've had since leaving my ma's table. Then you should write to your mother, Margaret said tartly. She's probably worried about you. The young man blushed and ducked his head, but she noticed he did write a letter that week. In May, with Margaret 7 months pregnant and moving more slowly, Sarah Chen arrived at the ranch driving a wagon full of supplies. Baby things, she announced. Blankets and gowns and nappies. I've been collecting them from women around the valley. Everyone wanted to contribute. Margaret was overwhelmed by the generosity. Soft cotton receiving blankets, tiny gowns sewn with careful stitches, practical supplies they would desperately need. Sarah, this is too much. It's not nearly enough. You're part of this community now, Margaret. We take care of our own. Sarah helped her unpack the supplies. And Emma wanted me to tell you she'll come stay with you when your time gets close. Her baby's due a month after yours, so she'll still be mobile enough to help. I can't ask her to do that. You're not asking. We're telling you. Sarah's voice was firm but kind. This is how we survive out here. We help each other through the hard things. Margaret had to turn away to hide her tears. She'd spent so long being self-sufficient, never asking for help, never expecting kindness. This evidence of community, of belonging, cracked something open inside her. June brought heat and the first real test of Margaret's strength. She was 8 months pregnant now, huge and uncomfortable, her back aching constantly, her feet swollen. The baby pressed on everything, making breathing difficult and sleep nearly impossible. She moved through her days with grim determination, cooking and cleaning and managing the household even as her body protested every movement. Elias watched her with concern. "You should be resting." "I've rested enough. If I sit still too long, I'll go mad." "Margaret, don't." She turned to face him, one hand supporting her aching back. "Don't ask me to stop being useful. I know I'm ungainly and slow and probably in the way, but I need to feel like I'm still contributing something. You're growing our child. That's contribution enough." "Not for me, it isn't." Her voice broke slightly. "I need to be more than just a vessel for this baby, Elias. I need to still be myself." He crossed to her and pulled her as close as her belly would allow. "You'll always be yourself. Being a mother doesn't erase who you are. It adds to it." "How do you know?" "Because I knew my mother. She was fierce and independent and capable even while raising me. She never stopped being herself." Elias kissed her forehead. "You're going to be an amazing mother, Margaret, and you're going to do it your way, not anyone else's." Emma Henderson arrived in early July, bringing her 3 children and settling into the spare room with the calm competence of someone who'd done this before. Her own pregnancy was visible now, but she moved with practiced ease, helping Margaret with tasks that had become difficult, teaching her things no book could convey. "When the pains start, don't fight them," Emma said one evening as they sat shelling peas. "Work with them. Your body knows what to do, even if your mind is frightened." "Were you frightened with your first?" "Terrified. I was 17, living in a soddy 30 miles from the nearest neighbor, and my husband was away on a cattle drive." Emma smiled at the memory. "I had that baby alone except for our old dog, and I was convinced I was going to die. But I didn't. And the second time was easier, and the third easier still. You learn to trust yourself." Margaret absorbed this, storing it away like precious knowledge. She'd spent so much of her life in her head, solving problems through logic and planning. But birth wasn't something you could plan your way through. It required a different kind of strength, a different kind of trust. The baby came on a sweltering afternoon in late July, 3 weeks earlier than Emma had predicted. Margaret had been in the garden, harvesting beans despite the heat, when the first pain hit, a tightening across her belly that made her gasp and straighten. "Emma!" she called, and within moments Emma was there, taking one look at Margaret's face and nodding. "It's time. Come on, let's get you inside." The next hours were a blur of pain and effort, unlike anything Margaret had experienced. Emma was there, calm and steady, guiding her through each contraction, reminding her to breathe, to rest between pains, to trust her body. Sarah Chen arrived sometime in the afternoon, bringing cool water and clean linens. Elias paced outside, banned from the bedroom, but close enough that Margaret could hear his footsteps when the pain got too intense. As evening approached and the light turned golden through the windows, the pains intensified to something almost unbearable. Margaret gripped Emma's hand and bore down with everything she had, driven by instinct and desperation and the fierce need to meet this child she'd been carrying. "Almost there," Emma said. "One more push, Margaret. You can do this." Margaret pushed with strength she didn't know she possessed, and suddenly there was release and relief and the sound of a baby crying, thin and outraged and absolutely perfect. "A girl," Emma said, tears in her eyes. "A beautiful, healthy girl." Sarah wrapped the baby quickly and placed her on Margaret's chest. Margaret looked down at her daughter, red-faced and screaming, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably be brown like Elias's, and felt love crash over her like a wave. "Hello," she whispered. "Hello, little one. I'm your mother." Emma opened the door to let Elias in, and he came to the bedside with wonder written across his face. "Margaret, oh Margaret, meet your daughter." Elias touched the baby's tiny hand with one finger, and she gripped it reflexively. His face transformed with such pure joy that Margaret started crying again. "She's perfect," he said. "You're both perfect." They named her Catherine Rose. Catherine for Elias's mother, Rose for Margaret's. She was a good baby, settling into life with the same calm determination her mother had shown. She nursed well, slept in reasonable stretches, and watched the world with serious dark eyes that seemed to take in everything. Margaret discovered that motherhood was simultaneously harder and more rewarding than anything she'd ever done. The exhaustion was brutal, the constant demands relentless. But watching Catherine grow, seeing her smile for the first time, feeling tiny hands grip her finger, these moments made every sleepless night worthwhile. Elias was a devoted father, surprising Margaret with his natural tenderness. He would walk the floor for hours with Catherine when she was fussy, singing her soft songs in his rough voice. He changed nappies without complaint and learned to soothe her cries almost as effectively as Margaret could. "You're good at this," Margaret said one night, watching him rock their daughter to sleep. "I want to be. I want her to grow up knowing she's loved, that she matters, that she can be anything she wants to be." Elias looked down at the sleeping baby. "I want her to have what you didn't have, certainty that she's valued just for being herself." Margaret's throat tightened. "She will. We'll make sure of it." Summer passed into autumn, and Catherine thrived. Margaret gradually regained her strength and returned to the work she loved, now with a baby wrapped against her chest in a sling Emma had taught her to make. She cooked with Catherine drowsing against her heart, tended the garden with her daughter watching birds and clouds, lived her life with this small person as a constant, beloved companion. The ranch prospered. Elias sold several horses at excellent prices, and they began to talk seriously about expanding, maybe building that second barn, maybe purchasing more breeding stock. Margaret kept meticulous books, tracking every expense and profit, and discovered she had a talent for the business side of ranching. One afternoon in October, a stranger rode up to the ranch, a well-dressed man who introduced himself as a book distributor from Helena. "I heard there was a woman in these parts who knew books," he said. "Someone who might be interested in serving as a local representative, taking orders from folks in the valley, distributing catalogs." Margaret stared at him. "Where did you hear that?" "Fellow named Elias Boone wrote to me. Said his wife used to run a bookshop and might be interested in connecting people with reading material." The man smiled. "There's money in it, not a fortune, but decent commission. And you'd be doing a service. A lot of people out here are hungry for books but have no way to get them." Margaret turned to look at Elias, who was watching from the barn with a slight smile. "What do you think?" the distributor asked. "I think—" Margaret adjusted Catherine in her sling and felt possibility unfold before her. "I think I'm very interested. Let's talk specifics." That winter, Margaret Boone became the unofficial book agent for the Copper Springs Valley. She took orders from neighbors, distributed catalogs, helped people choose titles that would suit them. It wasn't the bookshop she'd once dreamed of, but it was something, a way to connect with her old love while building her new life. And when spring came again, bringing Emma's new baby and green grass and foals born to their mares, Margaret stood on the porch of the house that had become her home and took stock of her life. She had a husband who loved her, respected her, and treated her as an equal partner in everything. She had a daughter who was healthy and happy and growing more alert every day. She had work that challenged her and a community that valued her contribution. She had a home built not on wealth or position, but on honest labor and mutual respect. She thought about the woman who'd stood at Victor Langdon's locked gate 18 months earlier, desperate, humiliated, nearly broken. That woman had believed she was worth only what others decided to give her, that her value was conditional on being useful or agreeable or good enough. Margaret Boone knew better now. She'd learned that her worth was inherent, not earned, that she deserved love and respect not because she'd proven herself, but simply because she existed. That partnership meant supporting each other's dreams, not sacrificing one person's aspirations for the other's comfort. She'd learned that home wasn't a place or a status, but a feeling. The certainty of being known and valued, the comfort of working beside someone who saw your best self and helped you become it. Elias came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her and Catherine both, the three of them a unit now, a family. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That getting rejected at that gate was the best thing that ever happened to me." "Not the worst? Not even close. If Victor had let me in, I'd have everything I thought I wanted and nothing I actually needed." Margaret leaned back against Elias's solid warmth. "Instead, I have this. A real home, real love, a real life. Everything that matters. We've built something good, haven't we? We've built something extraordinary." Margaret looked out over the ranch they'd defended together, the land they'd worked to make productive, the future they were creating for their daughter. "And we did it our way, on our terms." Catherine stirred in her sling and made a small sound. Margaret touched her daughter's soft hair and felt gratitude so intense it was almost painful. This child would grow up knowing she was wanted, valued, loved unconditionally. She would see her mother as a full person with dreams and capabilities beyond motherhood. She would watch her parents work as equals and learn that partnership meant mutual respect, not hierarchy. "I love you," Margaret said to Elias. "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible to everyone else." "I love you too. Thank you for taking a chance on a lonely rancher who had no idea how much he needed you." They stood together as the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in impossible colors, and Margaret Boone felt completely, perfectly content. She'd come west looking for security and found something infinitely more valuable: freedom. The freedom to be herself, to make her own choices, to build a life that honored her values and dreams. The freedom to fail and try again, to be imperfect and still be loved, to claim dignity on her own terms. Years later, when people asked Margaret about how she'd ended up in Montana, she told them the truth. She'd been rejected by a man too weak to stand up for his own choices, and that rejection had redirected her toward the life she was meant to claim. She told them about standing at a locked gate with nowhere to go and a quiet rancher who'd offered help without asking for anything in return. She told them about choosing love over security, partnership over convenience, dignity over comfort. And she told them that sometimes the worst moments of your life were just redirections, that closed doors could lead to open horizons, that what looked like failure was often just the universe pushing you towards something better. Margaret Boone had been abandoned at a gate and found her way home. She'd been deemed not good enough and learned she'd always been more than enough. She'd lost the life she'd planned and gained the life she never knew she needed. And every morning, when she woke beside Elias with Catherine sleeping in her cradle nearby, she thanked whatever force had brought her to that gate on that sweltering summer day. Because that moment of rejection, that instant of humiliation and despair, had been the beginning of everything good. The locked gate had been closed against her, but the horizon had been wide open, and Margaret Boone had claimed it all.